So as a disclaimer for the differences between my abstract and the paper, I just want to say that when I first planned it, I was envisaging a significantly longer paper. So I've had to make some radical cuts in the interest of time. So this paper explores Herodes' attempts to reconfigure the landscape of Marathon and shape the memory attached to it in his own image via a study of his material interventions in and around the Deme. It will focus most on the curse-inscribed herms of his favourite foster sons and on the Gate of Eternal Concord. But I'll also consider the poetic inscriptions that cast him as a kind of Hellenistic king bound to the Deme and characterise Marathon itself as an empty desert before the advent of his family. I'll also briefly examine some literary responses to Herodes' monumentalising, and I argue that Herodes' hero of Marathon persona was less an attempt to associate himself with the famous battle of 490 BCE than to displace the battle's significance to the plain in favour of his own. In general, Herodes' material efforts presented him as two things: the culmination of Greek heroic tradition and a player on the Roman stage as both imperial advisor and mediator between the Greek population and Roman power. To these ends, he adopted a number of material personae, such as a new Theseus or the hero of Marathon. As you can see here on the altar on the left, dedicated to Herodes above the Panathenaic Stadium at what might be his tomb, and in his appropriation of casualty lists of the Athenian dead from the Battle of Marathon. So these had previously adorned the Soros at Marathon, but Herodes removed them to his private villa in the Peloponnese at Loukou. The hero of Marathon identity is also a nod to Theseus, because that hero was held to have appeared as an apparition before the Athenian army at the battle and to have charged ahead of them against the Persians. Another identity Herodes adopts is the Greek wise man or counsellor of a foreign monarch in the mould of a Solon or an Aristotle. So as you can see in this trio of busts set up at Brexida on the plain at Marathon, copies of which were also dedicated at the sanctuary of Rhamnusium Nemesis. Here Herodes plays off his role as a tutor to the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus to suggest an ongoing guiding influence. These identities are Athenocentric, but designed to resonate beyond the confines of Attica by engaging with key figures and events of Greek history and the landscapes in which they occurred. Another important aspect of Herodes' heroic persona is his emotional volatility. In fact, he's often characterised by both emotional and monumental excess. His anger, grief, and building come in epic proportions. In his Attic Nights, Aulus Gellius, for example, reports a speech by Herodes in response to a Stoic philosopher's accusation that he failed to endure his grief over the death of a beloved boy with sufficient wisdom and manliness. Herodes' defence against the Stoics' attack presents his emotional volatility as rather the result of having a great soul and a lively intellect. Although he acknowledges that unrestrained emotion is a fault, he casts Stoic apatheia, or lack of feeling, as a step too far in the opposite direction and as a kind of living death. With all the soul's more vigorous emotions cut out, he says, they, meaning adherents of apatheia, grow old in the numbness of a spiritless and practically inanimate life. As well as carrying the sense of inanimation, Enoartus here implies the acquisition of effeminacy, so Herodes suggests that emotional expressiveness is in fact the behaviour correct to a man. He thus creates his own model of Hellenic Roman masculinity based on this performative emotional volatility. In his extensive monumentalising throughout Greece and beyond, Herodes uses his emotions to stake claims to space. A number of his material commemorations are designed to focus on his suffering and embed it and himself in the regions they mark. Marathon is a particularly rich side of this kind of activity, and it will be my focus today. In particular, I'll consider two examples: the inscribed portrait herms of his favourite foster sons and the Arch of Eternal Concord that marked a boundary on his Marathon estate. I'll also discuss two other inscriptions associated with Marathon, which contain the same sense of overwriting meaning in the landscape. So an idiosyncratic expression of his personal commemorative project was a series of posthumous portrait herms for his three favourite foster sons, Polydeuces, who is always referred to epigraphically as Polyjukian, Memnon, and Achilles. And Achilles' portrait is uncertain, but here are a couple of that have been suggested for him. These herms were set up on his estates and are notable for a number of reasons. First, they create a distinct portrait type for the boys, which are then repeated and propagated. Second, many were inscribed with curses against anyone who might damage or move them. I won't go into the text of the curses, but they act to bind the monuments to the land itself, regardless of the passage of time. Herms are a particularly Attic median, and one of their primary functions is to mark boundaries. Through Hermes, they were associated with learning and protection, which was the benefits Herodes provided to his foster sons. A connection also existed between Hermes' death and the path to the underworld through Hermes in his role as psychopomp. Herms were therefore often used as grave markers. With Herodes' herms, the function of commemorating the dead was combined with that of herms as localised shrines, a common use in classical times, so that the herm infuses the region that it marks with some kind of sanctity. More important are the heading or dedicatory inscriptions that identified the individual represented in the portrait and embedded some aspect of their relationship to Herodes in the surrounding landscape. So, for example, the heading inscription on a herm dedicated to Herodes' favourite foster son, Polyjukian, from Kephissia and now in the Ashmolean, reads, "Hero Polyjukian, once at these crossroads with you I used to wander about." The heading assigns Polyjukian the status of hero and so provides an example of a herm acting as a local shrine. It also embeds Herodes' experiential memories, feelings of loss, and Polyjukian's presence in the place it marks. The herm's placement at crossroads is also significant, and I'll come back to that shortly. Another herm from Varnava near Marathon, dedicated to Herodes' foster son Achilles, reads, "Herodes to Achilles, so that I may see you also in this grove, I myself and anyone else who comes here. And to that man at least you will be remembered for our great shared affection. Sacred to Hermes, the guardian and shepherd, I render you." This herm's heading ties a distinct location to a more expansive remembrance of extended emotional experience associated with close affection or philia, and implies a continuing, lingering presence. Herodes' precise relationship to the boys is unclear. His attempts to associate Polyjukian with Antinous via monumental commemorations and posthumous heroisation raise at least the possibility of pederasty, but it's probably more his association with Hadrian that Herodes is after in this parallel. The herms themselves cast him as the boy's teacher and protector. So in this herm, he compares his love to Polyjukian to that of a father for a son. So the herms come to replace the boys in the land of the living, but they're refracted through the lens of Herodes' own emotions and his memories. The idea that landscapes could be haunted was current in Herodes' day. His contemporary Pausanias, for example, recorded the haunting of the Marathon plain by combatants in the famous battle, saying, "At Marathon every night you can hear horses neighing and men fighting." Philostratus describes other examples, footprints left by the shadowy Protesilaus that evince the reality of his sacredness and the sacredness of the space that he occupies for the Phoenician sailor in the Heroicus, or Achilles' ghost who loiters around his tomb in Troy in honour of Apollonius of Tyana. Places that have witnessed significant events, like battlefields, or that house the dead, like cemeteries, were thought to attract and generate such apparitions. So in this context, Herodes' groves, and especially crossroads, become important. The portraits on the herms add to this haunting effect by harnessing a cultural anxiety over the potential of statues to become animated that in its most basic form was manifested by sweating. So by tapping into these ideas of continued, if ghostly, heroic existence and the signs it can leave, Herodes creates a context for the passerby of how to understand the monument and its function within its surrounds and within commemorative tradition. Herodes' herms are complex memorials. They crystallise his feelings of love, loss and nostalgia. And via these herms, Herodes elevates his personal emotional experience and the boys themselves to a heroic register fitting the landscape of Marathon, even though the events that are recorded in the inscriptions are repetitive, mundane activities of everyday life. So A herming Cartosuli announces Polyducian, whom as though he were a son, Herodes loved, and here he set him up, because here they used to hunt. Or one of an unknown find spot, now in the Epigraphic Museum in Athens, explains, here we would eat together and we would all make a libation. So the repeated use of enthade enhances this sense of funereal commemoration attached to the herms, because it was regularly used in funerary epigram within the common formula enthadicatae. Additionally, the everyday activities described are expressed by the imperfect tense, giving a sense of repetition and habit. So the reactivation of the inscriptions with every individual reading reveals Herodes' attempts to imprint the landscape not only with his memory of the boys, but with the boys themselves engaged in various actions of the living in which he too shared. This reanimating intention is humorously captured by Philostratus' description of Herodes' efforts that invokes a quality akin to stop-motion animation. So he put up images of them hunting, having hunted, and about to hunt. Philostratus is mocking Herodes' excess here. That's also signalled in his redecoration of his house entirely in black. And Herodes' younger contemporary Lucian in his Demon Acts also pokes fun at the theatricality of Herodes' mourning in his insistence on persisting as though Polyducian was still alive, so that he would have dinner served for the boy or his chariot made ready. So both Lucian and Philostratus pick up on Herodes' efforts to ritualise his emotional connection to the dead boys through the repeated reliving of earlier experiences and through the imprinting of a personally constructed meaning onto existing space, whether it be the plain of Marathon or his own house. The rewriting of spatial memory encourages a wider remembrance of the youths, with the hope that it will not be Herodes alone who feels the reanimating and emotional effect when viewing the monuments. Such encouragement to feel like Herodes when looking at his monuments is a feature of another personal memorial on his Marathon estate, the Gate of Eternal Concord. So this monument stood at the entrance to an enclosure now known as the Mundra Tiskrias, or Old Woman's Sheepfold, that probably housed a villa given by Herodes to his wife as a wedding gift. This is suggested by the paired keystone inscriptions that proclaim homonoia athanatos, or eternal unanimity or concord, and create a division of space between Herodes, that which is outside the compound, and his Roman wife Regilla, which is inside the compound. Via the keystone inscriptions, the arch also intertexts with Hadrian's arch at Athens that delineates a spatial, cultural and temporal divide within the city, and Theseus's legendary pillar at the Isthmus of Corinth that marked the geographical boundary between Ionia and the Peloponnese. Herodes' arch in its initial form, in contrast, celebrates a bicultural union between a Greek and a Roman, as much as a division of space, of gender, and of social roles, so that between husband and wife. A secondary inscription added after Regilla's death, however, transforms the celebratory arch into a makeshift funerary monument, creating an architectural palimpsest. The secondary inscription is carved in small letters on the eastern pillar at eye level, so it has to be read up close, and it recalls Herodes' former happiness and laments his current devastation. So although the first couplet takes a third-person perspective of a passerby impressed by Regilla's space and the happiness of the harmonious marriage, so, blessed is he who has built a new city, calling it by Regilla's name. He lives in exultation. Maud Gleeson has shown that it's best placed in Herodes' mouth. So the emotional abyss between this new husband at third-person remove and the widower of the next couplet, who is immersed in immediate and intimate first-person grief, is accentuated in this way. So, but I live in grief because this dwelling of mine has been built without my beloved wife, and my home is half complete. The poem is full of Homeric allusions and the imagery of building. The most pertinent is the figure of Protesilaus in the Iliad and the words domos hemitelis, or house half complete, which describe the state of the home the warrior leaves to his grieving wife at the moment of his death. In Herodes' epigram, the gender roles are reversed so that he fulfills the part of Protesilaus' wife. So the arch comes to symbolise the division between life and death and the ruin of the marriage that it formerly celebrated. The effect of the juxtaposition between celebration and grief on the unsuspecting viewer could be abrupt and shocking. So as they approached the enclosure, they would see the arch with the inscription of eternal concord, and nearby seated statues of Regilla and Herodes, husband and wife, that were probably added at the same time as the epigram. The arch is regularly reconstructed with the statues sitting on either side of the gate, but there's no evidence of any foundations for this at the site. So Alfred Malwitz argued instead, in favour of a Nyskos containing the statues off to the side of the arch, based on archaeological remains and earlier traveller accounts. As a visitor walked through the arch, their eye would be drawn to the statues, and from the statues then to the secondary inscription, overturning the first impression of this joyous union that would have been gained from the keystone. The small writing, about 1.5 centimetres high, of the secondary inscription that's positioned at eye level creates an intimacy, and it invites the viewer to empathise with the mourning husband somatically and emotionally. And this slide is just to show you where that inscription is on the remains of the gate at the Marathon Museum, to give you some kind of impression of how big it is. The secondary inscription would also change the significance of the nearby Nyskos and statues, as they came to seem less like portraits of a happy couple and more like the sorry figures of classical funerary art in the vein of the popular seated funerary relief. So via the inscription on the internal face of the keystones of the gate's keystone, once inside the compound, the viewer finally finds out the identity of the bereaved husband, whose sculpted presence beside his wife in the Nyskos now materialises this living death of his boundless grief. In this way, the doubly inscribed arch entices the viewer to embody Herodes' desolation and empathise with its sudden, petrifying impact. Herodes' interventions are designed to guide the viewer to see the monument through his eyes. The statues and the larger inscription on the keystone demand initial attention, and the sentiment of eternal concord points to the slogan, Concordia Aeterna, associated with the imperial marriage of Antoninus Pius and Faustina. The later funerary inscription is placed at eye level, enhancing its visibility and ease of reading. Its use of Regilla's name links it to the keystone. The Nyskos and seated statues are cultural touchstones of grief. Every effort has been made here to force the viewer to experience the monument in its intended way, even if the archer's reception is ultimately out of Herodes' hands. So this fossilisation through grief is the inverse of Herodes' efforts to reanimate his foster sons. It's also not quite the transformation of Niobe who wept herself to stone either. Instead, Herodes borrows from the liminality of the arch itself to figure himself as liminal, as both alive and dead, as both statue and man, as the new husband of the first couplet of the epigram and the widower of the second. The form of the arch, like the herm at the crossroads, aids this characterisation by imbuing the space with a kind of transitional energy that evokes gods like Hecate and Hermes. Herodes' self-characterisation as Laodamia, the wife of Protesilaus, is more directed than simply the desire to add a Homeric dimension. Versions of her story tell either of the fleeting return of Protesilaus' ghost from Hades and Laodamia's choice to descend back with him, or of how she replaced her lost husband with a simulacrum made of wax, and that she killed herself as the only route to regaining his company when the image was destroyed. By casting himself as stuck between life and death, between statue and man, Herodes is consciously drawing on Laodamia as a culturally graspable mythic analogue for his pain. Her story becomes yet another way of sparking empathy in viewers and of guiding their interpretation. Importantly, Herodes' name doesn't feature in the secondary epigram. This isn't his epitaph, but Regilla's. Instead, Herodes' name on the internal face of the keystone anchors him to the world of the living and to the first phase of the monument as a celebration of marriage. Really? I'll try and speed up. Herodes' decision to erect this memorial gate on his private property was unusual. The public mode it imitates, this honorific arch, was always granted by the city rather than by the honorand, even in the case of Roman emperors. Its subsequent transformation makes it still more unique by overlaying a Herodes who is Thesian and Hadrianic through its connection to the Arch of Hadrian in Athens, with one who is now Laodicean, grieving, and turned to stone. The monument's request for the viewer to feel like Herodes is an attempt to redefine the landscape of the estate to one that is saturated by his grief. Importantly, Herodes' estate spread over much of the Deme of Marathon, so the arch stood within a landscape permeated by pre-existing and powerful memorial connotations and famous tombs, like the Sauros that held the fallen Athenians in the Battle of Marathon, or the related mound that held the Plataeans. The inscription on the inner face of the keystone of the gate indicates that whatever lies outside the enclosure should be conceptualised as Herodes' space. Clearly, this indicates the entire estate, minus Regilla's compound, but perhaps the intention is to claim more territory, so the entire Deme, Attica, Roman Achaea, or even beyond. Herodes' space is therefore bounded more by his ambition than by any physical barrier. The funereal repurposing of the arch then changes his conception as well, as his wife, his foster son as a herm, along with the glorious dead of Marathon, find themselves embedded within a newly created landscape of private grief, rather than that famous Marathon plain. So not only is Marathon his personal possession, it's also saturated by Herodes' emotions of mourning. Herodes' casting of Marathon as a space of malleable significance is replicated also in two other poetic inscriptions from his estate. Almost done, I promise. Both contribute to the erasure of the importance of the battle from the plain and promotion of Herodes' own. One celebrates his return to Marathon after being acquitted of tyranny by Marcus Aurelius and addresses Marathon as a place far more blessed and significant than before, now that Herodes is back. It goes on to dramatise the gods and the citizens of Athens welcoming him to the city as though he were a Hellenistic king or Roman emperor. The other celebrates his father's arrival in the Deme and names the estate Atticus after him. In this inscription, despite its rich and illustrious history, Marathon is visualised as empty, desolate, and lacking definition and significance before Herodes and his father transform it into a space famous for olive trees, vines, grains, and game hunting. The secondary inscription on the gate and its associated statues undo this transformation, as the vitalising force with which Herodes is here characterised is there rendered cold dead stone through his sorrow at Regilla's passing. If you're moved by Herodes' stone narrative of grief, then you acquiesce to his appropriation of Laodicea's story and his reformulation not only of the arch and its immediate surrounds, but also the broader cultural, historic, and political sphere of his personal influence that it stakes out. So this is not the plain haunted by the dead of the famous Battle of Marathon, but Herodes' space. And his hero of Marathon persona is less an attempt to associate himself with the battle and Athens' achievement, and more an attempt to overwrite the battle in favour of his own. So the rewriting of existing spatial associations and memories to suit Herodes' commemorative and emotive narrative is a snapshot of his larger memorial program that aimed through large-scale public euergetism to build his and his family's memory into the significant spaces of Greek culture and history. In all cases, Herodes strove to rewrite the meaning attached to these spaces so that he and his family were promoted in importance and contrast to the famous events of classical Greek history, and often also in relation to the imperial family. His commemorative mode is therefore agonistic, but also dependent on existing cultural associations. Marathon is chosen because it's Marathon. The memory attached to such spots couldn't be completely obliterated, but were rather reprioritised. The difference with the private memorials is the focus on Herodes himself, the monumental demand to embody Herodes' Greece, appreciate the commemorative impulse it inspired, and acquiesce to his personal redefinition of spatial meaning, cultural memory, and even Hellenic Roman masculinity, which was surely modelled on the boundless grief of heroes like Achilles and Heracles, or, in the case of the Gate, on heroines like Laodamia. Herodes' contemporaries, however, recognised a more tyrannical quality to this brand of memory reconstruction, and this is shown by his trial for tyranny in over Athens in 174, the rumours of Regilla's murder, frequent literary juxtaposition to philosophers, the natural enemies of tyrants, and Lucian's satiric construction of him as a tyrant in works like Icaro or The Downward Journey. This alternative tyrannical casting placed him in competition with Hadrian in particular in Athens, which had the greatest stake in the marathon legend, and in this competition, Herodes was found wanting. Thank you. Sorry.